Pour gasoline into a diesel and you've killed it. Wrong fuel in the tank, and a normal engine knocks itself apart or simply refuses to light. Now, pour gasoline, jet fuel, and kerosene, together in the same tank, into the truck the United States Army built for the end of the world. It doesn't seize, it doesn't knock, it doesn't even hiccup. That truck is the M35, 2.5 tons, 6 wheels driving, a profile so common across 40 years of American military life that if you served anywhere between Korea and the Gulf, you rode in one, slept under one, or stood cursing at one in a motor pool at 4 in the morning. Soldiers called it the Deuce and a Half. For an entire generation of American servicemen, it was simply furniture, the truck that was always there, hauling troops and towing trailers, sitting in the cold, breathing a faint kerosene haze while everyone waited on somebody else. And bolted into the nose of it was an engine that, on paper, could drink almost anything flammable you put in front of it. Diesel, aviation kerosene, jet fuel, heating oil, even gasoline if it came to that. The strange part isn't that it worked. The strange part is that the Army would spend the next 20 years quietly making sure it never had to. By the time most of these trucks reached a civilian buyer, the single most famous thing about them had already been switched off, deliberately, with a stencil and a paintbrush. But to understand why they turned it off, you first have to understand why anyone wanted it. And that reason has nothing to do with saving money. Roll the clock back to the 1950s. The men planning America's ground forces weren't worried about the next war looking like the last one. They were worried about the next war being nuclear. And in their models, the first thing a nuclear exchange destroys isn't cities or armies. It's infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, fuel depots, the quiet, fragile network that turns crude oil into the one specific liquid your engine happens to need. Knock that network flat, and the most powerful army on Earth becomes a parking lot full of machines with nothing to drink. Picture the problem from inside that war room. You've built an army that runs on diesel, and the diesel is gone. There's a depot 40 miles up the road, but all it has left is aviation kerosene and a stack of gasoline drums. In a conventional fleet, that fuel is useless to you. Worse than useless, because pouring it in wrecks the few engines you have left. So, the requirement that came down was almost absurd in its ambition. Build a tactical truck that doesn't care. One that runs on diesel, kerosene, jet fuel, or gasoline, whatever the apocalypse happens to leave lying around. That was the brief. A doomsday hedge on 6 wheels. The only question was how you build an engine that ignores the rules every other engine is forced to obey. Because there's a reason your car is fussy about fuel, and it isn't marketing. A diesel has no spark plugs. It works by squeezing air until it's hot enough to ignite fuel on contact. You spray a fine mist of diesel into that superheated air, and it lights itself off the heat alone. The whole system lives or dies on the fuel, igniting at exactly the right instant. Pour in gasoline, which is built to resist igniting, the exact opposite of what a diesel wants. And one of two things happens. Either it won't light at all, or it hangs in that superheated air, piling up, and then catches all at once in a violent hammer blow. The knock that can pound a diesel to scrap. Every fuel carries a number, cetane for diesel, octane for gasoline, describing how willing it is to ignite, and an ordinary engine is built around one narrow slice of that range. So, the multifuels designers did something that sounds, on first hearing, like cheating. They stopped trusting the fuel to light itself cleanly and built the engine to do the lighting for them. Instead of misting all of it into open air and waiting for it to catch, the multi-fuel sprays most of its fuel as a thin film onto the wall of a small, sphere-shaped bowl carved into the crown of the piston. Only a tiny pilot spray goes into the air. That little pilot lights first, and the heat it throws vaporizes the fuel off the hot wall a sip at a time, peeling it from the surface and feeding it into the flame gradually instead of all at once. Combustion stops being a single blast and becomes something closer to a controlled, drawn-out burn, stretched across the power stroke rather than detonated at the top of it. Sit with what that does. The fuel is no longer detonating in a cloud. It's evaporating off a hot surface, like water flicked onto a skillet, and burning as it lifts away. And once you're cooking fuel off a wall instead of exploding it in midair, The fuel's eagerness to ignite, the cetane, the octane, the number every other engine worships, barely matters anymore. That's the secret. That's the entire trick. Not a magic fuel, not a clever additive in a can. The engine burns almost anything because it refuses to let the fuel decide when it burns. A German engineer christened it the M system, and it's the real reason the Deuce earned its legend, which is exactly the moment to take that legend and cut it down a size. Because somewhere along the way, it'll burn almost anything, curdled into, it'll burn literally anything. Spend 10 minutes in the old forums and you'll be told these engines ran on whiskey, on perfume, on vodka, on used cooking oil, on transmission fluid, on whatever a survivalist had sitting in his garage. Most of that is folklore. The real list, the one printed in the technical manuals rather than posted on a prepper board, was disciplined. Diesel grades 1 and 2, aviation kerosene like Jet A and Jet B, the military's JP4, JP5, and JP8, and fuel oils number 1 and 2. Low-octane gasoline was allowed as well, but with a string attached that could quietly kill the engine, and we'll get to that. So, this was never a furnace that ate anything flammable. It was a precision instrument tuned for a specific military menu, and keeping that instrument fed across that menu turned out to be a far nastier engineering problem than getting it to light in the first place. Start with where the idea even came from, because it carries an irony almost too good to be true. The combustion system at the heart of this all-American workhorse, the truck that carried American soldiers through Vietnam and filled motor pools from Germany to Korea, wasn't American at all. It was licensed from MAN of Germany, Maschinenfabrik Augsburg Nürnberg. The man who developed it, Siegfried Maurer, built the M process at MAN in the mid-1950s. And he wasn't chasing fuel flexibility. He was chasing silence. Maurer's entire goal was a quieter diesel. That gentle, gradual burn, fuel peeling off a hot wall rather than going off in one hammer blow, doesn't produce the violent combustion spike that makes an ordinary diesel clatter. It burns smoother and it burns softer. It works so well that Maurer earned a nickname, the father of the Flüster motor, the whisper engine. Hold on to that word, whisper, because of what the Americans would do to it. And there's a quiet business knife buried in here too. Rayo, the company that designed the M35 truck itself, built its own multi-fuel engine and put it up for the contract. Rio lost. The engine work went to Continental, which built its version, the Hypercycle, under license from the Germans, with Hercules and White Motor turning out engines as well. So the firm that drew the truck didn't get to power it. The heart of America's military workhorse was German combustion science, built by a company that had nothing to do with designing the truck it lived in. And the instant you take Maurer's elegant idea out of a German laboratory and ask it to survive an American war, the elegance starts colliding with reality. Hard. Here's the first wall it hit. The injection pump on this engine doesn't measure fuel by energy. It measures by volume. It shoves a set amount of liquid into each cylinder for a given throttle position. That's fine if you only ever burn one fuel, but a gallon of gasoline doesn't carry the same energy as a gallon of diesel. Diesel is denser. It packs more punch per gallon. So set the throttle, swap fuels, and you've silently changed how much energy you're feeding the engine, by 20% or more, purely from what's now in the tank. The entire point of the truck was to switch fuels freely. And switching fuels freely meant your power output lurched every time you did it. The fix was a small mechanical brain doing arithmetic nobody could see. They called it the fuel density compensator, and it did something quietly brilliant for a device with no chip in it. It sensed the density of whatever fuel was flowing through and physically trimmed the amount injected to match. More of the thin, weak stuff, less of the dense, strong stuff, holding output roughly steady no matter what you poured in. It was calibrated around 4 reference fuels: combat gasoline at the volatile end, the 2 diesel grades, DF1 and DF2, at the other, and CITE, a kerosene-type reference fuel sitting in between. A purely mechanical gadget sitting in the fuel line, correcting for the apocalypse. Without it, a driver swapping from diesel to gasoline at a field fuel point could climb back in to find a truck that suddenly felt gutless, or one that surged, the same throttle, a different animal underneath. The compensator made the fuel in the tank somebody else's problem. But the very trick that makes the whole thing work, cooking fuel off a hot wall, comes with a built-in weakness, and it's one every operator who ever turned one of these over on a frozen morning knows in his bones. The wall has to be hot. The chamber has to be hot. Try to evaporate fuel off a cold surface and it won't vaporize cleanly. It pools, it half burns, and it comes out the stack as great rolling clouds of bluish-white haze. Anyone who watched a multifuel Deuce cold idle on a January morning watched it sit there fogging the motor pool in pale smoke that stung of half-burnt kerosene, the engine fighting to cook fuel off walls still too cold to cook anything. So, the engineers fought the cold, the only way the engine would accept, with heat, applied before combustion. They routed engine coolant through the intake manifold to warm it, and then they added something blunter still, a flame heater inside the intake, a device that lights an actual flame in the intake tract to warm the incoming air before it ever reaches a cylinder. To start the engine that burns anything, you first lit a small fire to heat its breath. The Doomsday truck came with a pilot light. Starting one on a hard winter morning was a ritual in itself. You didn't just turn a key and roll. You worked the heater, you waited, and only once it had warmed enough to burn clean would it settle into something willing to pull a load. And then there's the catch hiding inside. That one permitted fuel, gasoline. The manuals allowed it. What they didn't paint on the side of the truck was what it quietly did to the engine. A diesel injection pump is a precision assembly machined to brutal tolerances, and it leans on the fuel itself for lubrication. Diesel is oily. It does that job without being asked. Gasoline does not. Run straight gasoline through that pump, and you strip away the very film of lubrication it needs to live. And you grind it to death from the inside, slowly, while the truck keeps running just fine. The field fix was as crude as it sounds. Crews poured motor oil straight into the fuel tank, at least a quart of clean oil for every 15 gallons of gasoline, to give the pump something slick to live on. And gasoline was never meant to be the daily diet. It was the break glass option, the fuel of absolute last resort, for the day when the only thing left at the depot was the one liquid that would keep you rolling while it ate your engine alive. The Americans never stopped tinkering. When they bolted a turbocharger onto the LD-465 to create the LDT-465, the natural assumption is that they did it for power, more boost, more horsepower, the reason anyone straps a turbo to anything. That's not why. The turbo was there mainly to clean up the smoke and help the fuel burn more completely, not to make the truck appreciably quicker. It added only a handful of horsepower. Its real job was cleaner air out the stack, killing the black soot and helping the fuel burn all the way down instead of leaving the cylinder as smoke. And here, the irony snaps shut. Mirror built this combustion system to whisper. The Americans took his whisper engine and hung a turbocharger on it. And an early version of that turbo, the 3LJ319, carried a nickname of its own, the Whistler. The quietest idea in diesel design ended up in U.S. trim, defined by a high-pitched whine. The whisper engine learned to scream. So, here it sits, an engine that ignores the chemistry of fuel, a mechanical brain that corrects its own power across 4 different liquids, a flame heater to wake it in the cold, a license reaching back to a German laboratory, an entire architecture built around one apocalyptic promise: pour in anything and keep moving. And in real service, almost none of it ever got used. The blunt truth the legend leaves out is that these trucks, the overwhelming majority of the time, ran on plain diesel, the same as everything else in the fleet. The nuclear war that justified the whole design never came. The desperate situation where a unit had to dump jet fuel and gasoline into its trucks just to survive simply never arrived at the scale anyone had feared. The capability sat there for decades, brilliant and idle, a flawless answer to a question the war never bothered to ask. So, the Army did something that tells you exactly how the experiment ended. Toward the close of the multi-fuel era, they went truck to truck and bypassed the fuel density compensators on many of them, disabled the very mechanical brain that made multi-fuel possible in the first place, and ruled the trucks diesel only from there on. Then they stenciled it right on the tank where nobody could miss it. Diesel fuel only. the single most famous feature this engine ever had, the thing its entire legend rests on, was switched off with a paintbrush before many of these trucks ever rolled onto a civilian lot, which is its own small heartbreak. Plenty of the people who bought these trucks surplus did it precisely for the legend, the idea that they now owned the machine that could run on anything, only to find the clever part already gutted, the compensator gone, the tank wearing 3 blunt words of paint. But disabling them one truck at a time was only the symptom. The real ending was a single decision that made the whole idea pointless overnight. And the Army reached it by solving the exact same problem the exact opposite way. The original logic ran: build one engine that can burn every fuel. Beginning in the late 1980s, the thinking flipped on its head. Instead of an engine that swallowed everything, the U.S. military would supply one thing for everything: a single battlefield fuel feeding ground vehicles and land-based aircraft alike. They settled on JP-8, a kerosene-based jet fuel, and set out to collapse a tangled supply chain that had been juggling half a dozen separate fuels down into one stream. And because JP-8 is close enough to diesel that a compression ignition engine runs on it without complaint, NATO no longer needed trucks that could drink anything. It only needed to guarantee there was only one thing to drink. That was the quiet death of the multifuel engine, not a failure. It did exactly what it was designed to do for decades. It was made unnecessary. The very fear that created it, the nightmare of a shattered fuel supply, was answered by the planners simply deciding there would be one fuel everywhere and building the logistics to promise it. The Deuce's whole reason for existing wasn't beaten in the field. It was engineered straight out of the supply chain it had been born to survive.